Thank you for coming. I'm Robert Reinhardt. I'm going to be talking about H.264 encoders today. I called this session Evaluating the Effectiveness of Your H.264 Encoder. I don't know if I meant to just not step on Jan's toes. I mean, Jan does a lot of the H.264 or just encoding sessions here in general, and his book is really good. He sent it to me a couple weeks before this to review, and the Sorensen squeeze coverage I thought was very helpful, even covering the latest version 9, which is now shipping. I'll be talking about some of the X264 stuff that's in Sorensen squeeze, but let's just get into the meat of it. I'll just say right off the bat, I don't really think there's a definitive way to encode. This is what the good news from the results of my testing, which I by no means call complete or definitive, is that encoders are getting more and more alike. So the stark distinctions that I saw when I did encoder roundups 5 years ago aren't there anymore. So for the most part, all the encoders are doing a pretty good job. These days, I just think the big 800-pound gorilla in the room is ffmpeg and X264. So even though I like all the vendors that create great software products, the devil's really coming down to a GUI interface. Do you like a GUI interface, and do you need a GUI interface? Then there's going to be distinctions between the different software offerings. If you're trying to build automated encoding systems and you have good developers and engineers, ffmpeg, and you're in control of your source. If you're in control of your source, that's a big plus. But I don't want to give away all my final recommendations. I'm sort of giving them away right now. That's no fun. So let's sort of build up some anticipation. So there's effectively three qualities that I think anyone would look for in a good encoder: quality, speed, and cost, right? Cost, all three of these factors all working together, I feel, probably make up 90% of the decision making that goes into any encoding workflow. And I think most of us really care about the first one that I put up there, which is quality. Of course, you have to turn around some content right away. I have a client right now that shoots live events, and they have a short window at which they can monetize the live event. So that speed is really important because they have to encode potentially up to 3-4 cameras worth of a live event, could be 4 hours long, and they might only have 48 hours to monetize it after that event happens. So that's really important. So quality, speed, and cost, I mean, I don't want to say, you know, pick two because you can only have two. Like if you want quality and speed, then it's probably going to be expensive, right? Because you're not, when I say cost effective, you know, cheaper. You know, if you want cost and quality, then, you know, something that's cheap, high quality, then it might not be so fast, right? So you, I'm not saying you can't have all three, depending on how you architect your solution, but typically you're probably only going to get two of these pieces of the pie weighing more than the third. Every encoder can do what I would call the basics that I have up here in this list. You know, it's all the common things that go into any video picture: dimensions, frame rate, codecs. Hopefully you have profile settings. That's still a bit of a distinction. I will talk about live encoders too a little bit. It's not part of my session description, so it's probably the most incomplete of any of the data I'm about to show you today. But live encoders are still in that world. I would say 5 years ago we're playing catch up with what options we have available to actually control in our live encoder. Audio bit rates, audio channels, and sampling rates. These are all what, you know, I take for granted. If it doesn't have this, then something's wrong with it, right? Then you're using YouTube. You just upload it and it does whatever it does to it, right? And then you hope it works out for the best. Beyond that, what do I look for in an H.264 encoder? I'm going to look for multiple H.264 codec options. I really only care about one these days. That's X264. I'm not saying that main concept isn't any good, but main concept just seems to have a certain set of options. X264 has others. When it comes to adaptive streaming, you have much finer control in X264. Anyone who works at main concept or maybe integrates main concept might disagree with me, but you want at least one of these options in your encoder. There's other H.264 codecs out there. Apple has their own. I can't even remember the one that D something, I think that episode used to use. They don't use them anymore. But main concept and X264, those are the two codecs I look for on the video. And B-frame controls. This is still something that's absent. I can open up Adobe Media Encoder now, and from Adobe CS3, and I'm still going to see the same lack of B-frame controls, right? I can't control, and a B-frame, if you don't know what a B-frame is, it's a bi-predictive frame. It's actually a magical frame. It can look forward and back, and you're like, how can a video look forward in time? It hasn't played that frame yet. That's why it's called frame reordering and compression tools. If you see a checkbox for frame reordering, that's the same thing as enable B-frames. B-frames, this is why B-frames are so complex. They are stored at the end of the GOP, right? But they're reordered on playback. So you have to download the chunk that has all your whole group of pictures, and then the decoder will reposition the B-frame because it knows then which frames it's borrowing information from. So that's why I can grab from a future frame. And that's why you won't even usually see it in live encoders, because the whole purpose of a live encoder is to get the stream out as quickly as possible. In order to build up enough of a buffer to use B-frames effectively, you're going to introduce latency, which might not be such a big deal if you're not live streaming an auction, for example. If it's a televised event or some other event that is already going to have a delay and there's a large buffer, 10 seconds is plenty delay to start introducing B-frame optimization. Profile control. So, and these are sort of in order of importance how I look at them. I mean, B-frames, I'm not saying are, I would say they're about on the same level as choosing a profile. These days, again, being able to pick baseline, main, or high. This was an option that you wouldn't see in some encoders in years past, but now all the encoders that I'm evaluating allow you to have this control, and that's important. I mean, 4 years ago, we didn't have the device concerns that we have today, so baseline being our go-to format to play everywhere, right? And a baseline profile H.264 file is going to play on the oldest BlackBerry, and it's going to work on the latest iPad. You don't get the best bang for buck with baseline because, like the name implies, it's at the bottom, right? Base, it's at the bottom. So it's introducing, it's of the simplest profiles. There's actually other profiles that H.264 has, but those are the three main ones. Read ahead. This is sort of an interesting one. Episode has this feature. ffmpeg and H.264 have this feature. It lets you control how far ahead we're reading in the source file to determine what we can do with our compression, with our bit budget. That, again, it's just another setting. Usually it's a frame setting, like how many frames are we going to look ahead. Usually there's a limit, like maybe up to 10 seconds your frame rate. So 300 frames looking ahead is usually considered a pretty far read ahead. And that goes beyond even 2-pass or 1-pass. I mean, some 1-pass and 2-pass encoders will, on the second pass, only read ahead so far. It's not like they do a complete 1-pass analysis phase before they start doing the 2-pass. That's why that you might see something even labeled as a fast 2-pass, because it's not actually reading the whole file in 1 pass before it starts to encode. It's only going to read ahead longer than it might for a 1-pass. Reference frame count. This is something where I'm going to have to rag on Sorensen for a little bit, because in their H.264 option, I'm pretty sure it's in the main concept one, but when I'm using if I have the option of using main concept over H.264, I'll use H.264. There's no reference frame count control for H.264 in Sorensen Squeeze. Why is that important? Because you can only have so many reference frames in those baseline encodes. And by default, Squeeze is using the maximum 16 reference frames. That's a lot of reference frames, people. You should be shocked. I don't see shock on your faces. You usually only want to have up to 3 reference frames. What's a reference frame? A reference frame is how many frames any individual frame can borrow its information from. And this is like if you look at an first generation iPod, if you want it to encode an MP4 file for first generation iPod, you can only have one reference frame in that baseline encode. That means that any given frame in a GOP can only look back 1 frame. That's it. It can only borrow, and there's a reason for that. You need more memory. The more frames you want to be able to reference to decode the current picture, the more frames you have to keep in memory. So in general, you don't want to go beyond 3 reference frames in your baseline encode. You can get away with more in a baseline encode, but you're going to reduce the compatibility you have with the range of devices that are out there. VBV Buffer Size. This is a more complex one. VBV stands for Video Bitrate Verifier, and it has to do with how the picture sequence is decoded in the player. And this is the one that will have the most profound effect on CBR and even VBR encodings out of H.264. Most encoders, Episode is the exception, and so is Sorensen with H.264, won't reveal the VBV buffer size, at least not as that term. It might be deeper or hidden. Adobe Media Encoder won't let you control the VBV buffer size. And by the way, since I'm mentioning this, I tweeted earlier, and if you don't follow Rob_Reinhardt, then you won't see the tweets. It is, I put it up on, oh, let me open up Google Drive here real quick. Where's my Google Drive? Where's Google Drive? I just had it open. Oh, there it is, Google Drive, right there. So I made this little review sheet. It's just going to open up. It's just a quick jump to this. So I will retweet this. It will be, it's linked in my session notes that I'm going to make a PDF of. But essentially, I went through all of the features that I look for in an encoder. Most of them I'm talking about now, and sort of said yes or no in these columns. So this is, I enabled to share this with the whole world. You don't have write access to it, but I have a VOD tab, I have a live tab, and the output that I'm going to show you some comparisons that I did. All the data that I put into that I gathered from my actual encoding results are up in this spreadsheet too. Spreadsheets aren't fun to look at though, so I'm only going to refer to them when I need to as we're going through some of the samples. So let me just jump back down here. Again, that's Rob_Reinhardt if you just search for the Twitter hashtag #SMEast or SMEast. You will find a tweet. I can't say it. A tweet from me about an hour ago giving the link to that spreadsheet, so you can bookmark it, whatever the heck you want to do. Entropy type. This is something that Adobe Media Encoder won't expose. This is Kavlik versus CAB-AC compression. CAB-AC can only be used in main or high profile or higher profiles if you're using at higher color spaces and stuff like that. You can't use CAB-AC entropy with baseline. All it is, it's like a better zip compression on the data that goes in there. It's more intense, it's more computational, and that's why baseline doesn't have access to it, because it's not going to work well on an older device or a slower smartphone. Kavlik or CAVLC is the easier type of compression, and it's not as optimal when it comes to the picture quality. So these are the main ones that I look for. This to me, if I get a checkbox on all of these, then I'm going to be fairly happy. If a client comes to me and they have already invested in a solution, if it doesn't have one of these, then I'm probably going to be a little concerned about to what degree we're going to be able to take any kind of revision to the workflow in terms of quality. Oh wait, one more, and of course encoding type, CBR versus VBR. And truth be told, depending on how your encoder works, CBR and VBR I think are just general classifications of how bit rate is controlled over a period of time, over the period of your keyframe interval, your GOP. So you can effectively mess up CBR if you control, like you can essentially take a CBR preset and make it pretty much VBR, or you could do the exact opposite. If you start opening a preset that's VBR and squeeze, you could pretty much make it CBR. So I put it last because it's a rather relative term in terms of how you're going to moderate the bit rate using other settings. These all typically influence one another when it comes down to real world science. Restrictions to keep in mind. And I mentioned some of these already. This is just a recap. And this came across recently on a project. I was using 16 reference frames is usually the max reference frame that any encoder will let you do. So again, that means one frame can reference up to 16 frames previous to the one being decoded. And that's reserved for main and high that you could use up to 16. I mean, you can use up to 16 on baseline, but again, it sort of goes against the whole idea of using baseline being efficient on slower devices or with less memory than your desktop or your tablets. I would recommend 14 or lower. 14 seemed to be a good magic number. If you, even on iPad, if you were doing HLS at 16 with a 16 reference frame count, and that's the default that Squeeze had for H.264, and you can't override it, that would technically produce a file that may not be playable on all iPads. The newest iPad can probably do it, but iPad 1 and 2 were breaking on 16 reference frames. 1 to 3 reference frames for baseline is my general rule of thumb. You can usually get away with 3. I've been doing testing with baseline more on older Android devices, because you can buy them pretty cheap now on Amazon. Just look for refurbished old Android devices. They're usually somewhere under $100. But so if you need to, you don't want to go to Device Anywhere to do your testing, you want a physical device. I can't remember the exact Android device that it was showing a problem, but I think we had 6 reference frames in a baseline profile. We reduced it to 3, and everything was working fine. If you really just want to cover all your bases and, again, be legacy compatible on some of the oldest iPods out there, 1 reference frame is going to be the number you choose. Also, I like fixed SCOP. So if you went to my workshops on Monday, you know that I'm a big fan of adaptive streaming. Of course, the biggest drawback to adaptive streaming is that it's not an HTML5 standard yet. MPEG- is not even really part of the HTML5 spec, but it's the closest we're going to get, hopefully, to browser vendors agreeing to something besides HLS, because essentially we just have Apple strong-arming everyone into using HLS. Google uses it on Android. They don't use it in Chrome, though, on the desktop. So regardless of what the future is going to be, for adaptive streaming, for chunking to work on video streams, fixed SCOPs are essentially a must. So make sure that whatever encoding you do, if you want it to be, doesn't matter if it's VBR or CBR even, as long as it's fixed SCOP, that means we have a keyframe at the beginning of each of those chunks, and it's going to chunk up whether we're using MPEG- or HLS. If you went to Netflix's session, I don't know, I missed the first 10 minutes of it, but I don't know if he talked how much he got into a GOP discussion that I may have missed, but it's just an important aspect of adaptive streaming. And now I have these links to that chart, those charts that I just showed you in terms of features for VOD and live encoders. And what I'm going to do now is, before I go to my next slide, oh, well, here it is. Just quickly to show you, I came up with, and these are pretty arbitrary tests, I'm not going to lie. I wanted to just sort of, and I picked just a 640 by 360 resolution to use across all of the tests. I basically have 40 files. I'm not going to be able to go through all of them. That'd be rather boring, I think, for you to have me go through every file. I think it's better if I just show you the summation of my observations from doing those 40 encodes. But basically, I have 4 presets that I did across baseline, and then those same presets adjusted for, oops, I didn't, let me magically update my slide here. I'm going to fix a typo. These should all say main. Sorry, main. Great, look at that. I just edited it on the fly in the webcast. Okay, and then so tests 5 through 8 were the exact same tests, but using the main profile. And I'll just quickly, so I did the same battery 4 tests. The first one, I tried to do a VBR Quality Base, meaning I didn't specify a bit rate. That's actually hard to do in main concept, because main concept doesn't have a quality-based value like H.264. If you've used H.264 before, there's a CRF value that you can set. The default's 21, and that's what I used. The lower you go with CRF with H.264, the closer you're getting to a virtually lossless version of the original. So if I have a CRF of 1, I'm going to have a much bigger file and bit rate than I would with a CRF of 21. And it's not an easy scale to try and sort of predict. I mean, I usually use a CRF anywhere between 15 and 30 if I'm going to be flexible with the range. But the default 21 is a generally good whatever you want to call it, a psychologically perceptive fine value to use. Like, most people aren't going to see the lossiness that's in the value of 21. So that's what I tried to mimic it with a decent VBR setting across main concept, but it's not an apples for apples. That was probably the hard. Presets number 1 and 5 that I'm about to show you are probably the most difficult. H.264 does have VBR and CBR modes too outside of its CRF mode. So what's nice about CRF is that you can basically, if you're doing a progressive download, you can just say, hey, I want my file to be at this quality. I really don't care about file size and about bit rate. I mean, obviously we do, and it comes out really nicely. I mean, it's a great compromise of quality versus file size, and H.264 does a great job of it. That's probably why it's a more popular codec among people who use it. The second preset, again, I'll go back to this is better numbering. I just doubled it up right for main. So the second one, I did a max bit rate over VBR. Both of those are dynamic GOPs, meaning that I let the encoder determine if a keyframe should be made or not. Those aren't going to be adaptive friendly, but again, if you're doing a progressive download or something that isn't going even pseudo streaming or HTTP range requests with HTML5, you don't need fixed GOPs for range requests to work, right? You can have a variable GOP. It's not a big deal. Presets number 3 and 4, however, were fixed GOPs with CBR and VBR. And again, these were just my particular flavors for this test. They weren't necessarily what I would consider, I didn't do a battery of adaptive bit rates and resolutions. I did 360p across the board for these just to have a consistent frame size and frame rate for it. My source file was just something from Getty Images. Let me bring that up real quick. Thought I had the, oh, there it is. No, not that one. Sorry. Let's do too many projects. Let's go into here. So there's all my 40 files, and my source file is this 1080p, 24p file from Getty Images, and it's just, I'll show you the source. I don't know if I have audio. I have the audio turned off. It's pretty cheesy audio. You don't really need to hear it. Do I have audio coming out? There it goes. It's just some music, right? It's like, it'll put you to sleep, right? So, and what I like about this clip is that, you'll see differences in compression with the sunlight on the waves. The waves are moving a lot. There's a lot of pixel density moving around there. These kind of like really, this fast pan here at the end. I mean, well, it's faster. I mean, there's a lot of, it speeds up at a certain point. So, I used this test 5 years ago for a white paper that I did for a vendor that they never published because they didn't like my results. But they didn't like what I had to tell them. But this was a very complex scene, like VP6 with FLV did not do very well in any encoder in this stretch. Like that nice line of the mountain, that was really hard to compress. I mean, this scene looks deceptively simple because it's slow. You'd think there's slow enough change in time, but enough is changing in this picture, and you can't even see half the detail that I'm seeing on screen. I will post my compression results. The source file is like 2 gig, so I'm probably not going to throw that up on VideoRx, but that's the sample that I used. So it had 3 cuts, 3 different sort of pictures involved, and that audio. I will admit that I wasn't doing much in the terms of AAC audio compression in terms of my testing here. So I'll show you how I generally go about it rather than go through every result that I did. And again, I'll put them all online so you can go through them in your own time if you really want to. I build my own tools when I can, and this is a free tool that I make available on VideoRx. It's called my video comparison tool. So anytime I want to compare, do an apples for apples or maybe even an apples for oranges comparison, just sort of comparing 2 things. I built, you'll have to forgive me, it's still using Adobe Air. If Phil Kerman were here, he'd just smack me upside the head. But if you don't know him, that's okay. But anyway, this video comparison tool is just a simple Flex app that I built and export it with Air. You can download it and use it now straight from the website. I'm going to launch it. Do I have it running already? Oh, I do. So basically what it lets you do is drag 2 videos in. They can be of different sizes. If this is a little buggy, so if you do have a larger dimension, say you want to compare your 720p to your 540p or something like that, drag the bigger one in number 1. So just remember, the first one should have the biggest video dimension-wise. All of mine are 360p, so it doesn't matter which I drag into it. But what, so if I'm just going to randomly pick 2. So if I take, let me close this up. I can take my Adobe Media encoder one and drag it over here, and it's going to load it up. And I'm going to take the same preset number 1 from Episode Pro. That's what the EP stands for, using H.264. And now I have them both there. And what's nice is that the play button is synchronized to both videos. So if I hit play here, they're both going to play, and I can drag this little bar across and sort of see, oh, there's the media encoder on the left and there's the Episode Pro on the right. I can sort of see, you can sort of, I don't know if you could, I should probably use the max zoom feature, but again, this is, I don't want to, my point is to just show you my methodology. You can go in your own time and sort of go through some of these comparisons on your own. The detail's going to be more sharp anyway on your own computer. And you can pause it, and there's just this little mask that you're dragging back and forth. The good news is that, I mean, there's some contrast subtlety, contrast differences among these encoders, which I think are important to keep in mind. There wasn't anything too grossly different in any of my presets. Again, the biggest difference is just modes that weren't available because I was using H.264 versus main concept. So if I open up Firefox again with this spreadsheet and I go to my output comparison, I already put here in bold, you can sort of see my bold, sort of which were the winners in terms of bit rate. Like ffmpeg H.264 had the lowest bit rate for as close as I could get to with an apples for apples comparison using a CRF with an equivalent VBR. So I could try and just dial down Adobe Media Encoder. The numbers are a little small. Let me see if I can, what's the shortcut for zooming? Apple Plus? Oh, that's in the. I want it to zoom the whole screen. What I do this, right? Don't you hold down Option Command and double scroll? How does that work? Does that not work anymore? I have to enable it in the preferences, but that's all right. That's all right. You can just squint but I will use the Apple Plus for now. That's plenty fine. That's perfect suggestion. Thank you. That you can at least see the columns that I need you to look at. So the bit rate was lowest with H.264, and you'll notice that even compared, I mean, Squeeze had even lower, it had it lower by 3 kilobits, not a substantial difference. 3 kilobits is not huge, but I disqualified Squeeze as a referee. I'm like, I'm blowing a whistle on you, you're not valid, because it uses 16 reference frames. That used 16 reference frames, whereas I restricted all the others. Well, Adobe Media Encoder, that's the good news. It automatically restricted baseline to 3 reference frames. Even though I couldn't control reference frames count, Adobe Media Encoder, for me, is a great baseline encoder. So if you need to just run a bunch of smartphone encodes, you already have Creative Suite. Baseline compression, I think, is great on Adobe Media Encoder. That's not saying a lot, but it's something. It's not saying a lot, but hey, I'll throw them a bone. So I made ffmpeg the winner because it used 3 reference frames and still had the lowest and the best quality among that set. And I can even, there's a subtle difference. I mean, if I loaded it up right now, just even outside of my comparison, it's pretty subtle, but there's the video. Like, there's no extreme blockiness for sure. There's no like craziness. If I played this video by its own and I played the other one by its own, you might notice that the waves, again, the contrast is really poor on that screen, but if you might notice some lack of sharpness and some of the crispness of the waves, but that was about it. That was it was very low, and at nearly half the bit rate, I thought that was amazing. Like, that there was minimal loss. Not exactly half the bit rate. My second version, the winner was still ffmpeg. That's where I had that was more apples for apples because I was basically forcing ffmpeg. And I'll give you my command line switches too. I actually have, just so you can see, if you don't know what ffmpeg is knowing, sorry, I'm remote controlling my Windows machine, and I have ffmpeg compiled on my Mac here. I'm that kind of geek, I compile my own software if I have to. And this is let me see if I can get word wrap working on here. Oh, it is turned on. Let me see if I can get word wrap. It's just because I'm at 1024 by 768 on this projection. So let me move it over here. So you can sort of see, let me blow this up too. That's pretty dinky. Let me increase the font size here. I'll save this text file. I have a version of it up on the stream media directory that I have on VideoRx, but it's not up to date. So that's a little better. So this is a typical ffmpeg command line. In case you don't know how it works, you basically specify an input. I specified a size. I mean, if you look at it, it sort of makes sense. It looks a little gibbery, but gibberishy, gibber. I don't know what the word is, but I used the very slow preset, which in Jan's book, Jan did a really great job of going through all of the presets from very slow to very fast, and basically concluded in his results, and I would tend to agree. The only thing I had a problem with Jan's compression test is that he used DV footage for all of his tests. He didn't use any HD footage because, for me, a lot of the subtlety of H.264 compression, motion estimation ranges, there's a lot of features that you can drill down to in H.264 really make a difference when you're dealing with bigger pixel areas, right? If you're like 640 by 360, it's a lot easier to do motion estimation range with a value of 16 on, because that's 16 pixels that it's looking for motion vectors on a 360p image. I mean, that's going to do more on a 360p image than 16 pixels would on a 1080p output, right? That's just math, right? 16 is a much smaller number in 1080, so if you increased it as you went up to 1080, you would be searching a greater range of pixels. So, but generally speaking, ffmpeg has these presets that basically will sort of enable more optimizations at the expense of time. And generally, I mean, I used very slow to basically let it, and I use very slow consistently in my H.264 test. So Sorensen squeeze, ffmpeg, and Episode Pro all now have an H.264 option. I should say ffmpeg's had it for a while. Squeeze and Episode Pro now have H.264 options, and they have these very same presets that are available in the command line version of ffmpeg with H.264. So I, again, wanted to keep it apples for apples. And for the most part, just since I'm going so much on a deep dive on ffmpeg here, if you compare ffmpeg in any of my results to Squeeze, the values were really were preset by preset, they were very close, right? Squeeze was 886 kilobits and ffmpeg was 903. I mean, again, it's a little over 14 kilobits difference, but not a huge difference. You'll notice Episode Pro came out exactly the same as ffmpeg for that preset using H.264. So that's the good news. The good news is that the H.264 implementations, especially with those presets, the very slow and fast, whatever settings that you can have, and I'll just show you. I've got the applications here. Why don't I just show you? Because I have the application. If I open it up here and I open up this preset in Squeeze, you'll see that they have those very same presets here. They're just, so what's interesting is that even though there's GUI tools now, all they've done is taken the command line and spit it out for you. You still have to know what the hell's going on with these. You can roll over and get a tooltip. It's like, this is a trade-off compression efficiency against encoding speed. It's like, okay, great, but it doesn't really tell me a whole lot as you go down. So, but pretty much every option that you see, again, reference frames aren't in here. I don't know why they're not. But if you can find it, let me know. But I did a search for like, there's a motion search range that goes up to 16, but I couldn't find reference frames anywhere. But every option that H.264 has is essentially revealed here. And I actually, from a geeky point of view, like the way that Squeeze does that. If I showed you Episode is a little, I mean, Episode doesn't want to freak out any of the people who've used Episode before. So, I mean, they did do a massive GUI change a while ago. But if I go down here to the same preset, I think I opened up number 2. It doesn't matter. But you can see here, it's a little small, but H.264 is in parentheses now. You pay more for the edition. So not only is it nearly, it's $1,000 for Episode Pro, but you pay on top of that, I think, an extra $300, $295. It's in that spreadsheet to get the H.264 option, which is a little crazy considering it's open source and free, and any one of you can download it and compile it and use it on your own. That's not to say you're not supposed to pay a commercial licensing. It's my opinion that, I mean, most H.264 usage that is done on the online today is probably done illegally, depending on how you make your video and monetize it. Just like Fraunhofer MP3 in the Flash days, right? Like everyone used MP3 in anything that they did. Did they ever pay Fraunhofer any licensing? No, but H.264 is the same way. There's commercial licensing for it. Squeeze and Sorensen and Telestream are both paying the core AVC group that tracks the H.264 licensing. So technically, if anyone builds a cloud encoder like encoding.com or Zencoder, they're using H.264 to monetize a product, you pay them a commercial license for using it, even though it's open source. So it's not necessarily free. If you're just using it for UGC content on a site, you likely aren't violating any licensing, but again, you probably might want to just take a look at VideoLand's site, just to, that's the site where you go to download H.264 source code. Same with ffmpeg. I don't think there's a commercial license for ffmpeg. Most products that say they use ffmpeg still make you download it separately, and because they can't, it's part of the license, you can't distribute ffmpeg. You can sell a solution that uses ffmpeg, but you sort of have to make your users go off and fetch it and then install it. That way they're not violating any rules there. At least that's the de facto, or sorry, de jure? How's that work in Latin? If there's a law that's not on the books, but it's enforced basically because of practice. Is that de jure? I can't remember my Latin. Do you guys remember? No? What? Okay, de jure. Oh, because de jure would mean it's codified, right? Because it sounds like a jury behind it. De jure. Exactly. De facto versus de jure. Excellent. Thank you. Such an idiot. Okay. So there we go. X2. Oh, I was going to show you where they show the very slow stuff. I go off on these tangents. It just happens. So here it is, preset very slow, right? So they put a space in it, so whereas Sorensen made it look exactly like the command line, but the same settings I have in episode that I do in Squeeze that I do in ffmpeg. I did also show Rosette in my settings, or in my battery results. I was and still am to a certain degree a fan of Rosette, mainly because they have a super nice API that I can control. I use it for my own compression on any workflows that I'm responsible for my clients. I have a pretty small installation of Rosette Carbon Coder, and I have a relationship with Rosette, so I don't have to pay $5,000 to $15,000 to use it. But it's an expensive product, right? Rosette is not cheap. It's meant for broadcast use. They don't really market it the same level that that Telestream and Sorensen market to. I wish they would bring it down a notch, but it's just like Adobe and their enterprise products. They don't get pricing, I think, that would make sense for smaller shops to utilize it, because they sort of deal in big numbers. That's just the way their business is organized. I'm slow, if it means anything, and again, this is no slight, and most of my work from a consulting level involves people wanting to own their encoding workflows. So that necessarily means that they want as much control as they can have. So building your own API or your own system with, in an encoding scenario is going to be something you can do with ffmpeg and X264, right? Because it's all command line. You can wrap it in Java. You could wrap it in whatever you want to fit into your system, .NET. All these other products that you pay for the fact that they've packaged it for you and they've built an API. They've done a lot of work around their own encoding tool to expose it so that you don't have to. I mean, obviously, if you're going to engineer your own workflow on AWS, you could probably get a two or three person team together and sort of hodgepodge something together really quickly. The more expansive and more comprehensive you want to do it, the more resources you're going to use, and it's not going to be cheap. But once it's in place, you own that whole flow. You own everything that goes in it. You know exactly what it does. You're not sort of stuck with like, well, Telestream hasn't let me do this yet, so I can't do it. So. And I'm a code geek. I like control, and you just need to find a few geniuses to build your system, and then you're good to go, right? That's not hard. So I laugh because it's not as clear cut. You're talking to someone who built his own encoding and hosting platform. So I just like, if I can do it, anyone can do it, right? It's not that hard. So let me go on to the last part of results that I want to talk about are geared to adaptive streaming. If you look at this chart, you might see that I have HLS average and HLS max. What the hell am I talking about here? Okay, so I did basically two presets that were along the lines of dynamic GOPS, quality based, and a VBR2 pass. The second two presets of each group I basically brought down to fixed GOPS so that they could be used with adaptive streaming. I did one CBR and one VBR. You probably heard Netflix saying that they use VBR encoding for all their adaptive streaming. And since they build like their own, except for HLS, most of the time they built their own heuristics engine. So however, I don't know how much the V is in VBR. I don't know how much they vary the bit rate in their VBR setting, because you can constrain VBR a lot so that it's effectively CBR. Like I said, the devil's in the details. But what's important in this data that I'm showing you, there's one thing. The main profile settings, by and large, are much lower bit rate for the same size that you had to baseline. So that's a given in any of the literature that you might read. You're going to get better quality for the same bit rate or at a lower bit rate with one profile over another. So if you look at presets, preset 5 is the main version of the baseline profile. It's 390 compared to 493. So it was substantially lower, especially, I mean, ffmpeg, not so much as it was in some of the other encoders. If we look at okay, so I want to break down, sorry, 7 and 8, the closed GOPs where it's not a dynamic GOP. I wanted to illuminate here one thing that most of my clients don't do, and that is do validation on any streams that they intend to run through HLS. Whether they upload them to Akamai or they're using Wowza, they don't run it through Apple's free tools. Sure, you have to have a Mac to run this tool set. I think there's some open source segmenters too, but if there's one thing I want you to walk away with knowing how to do, that is using media file segmenter. Let me see if I can. That's so small. Let's boost that up a little bit too. Is that in the view? Let's make the oh, come on, bigger. There we go. We'll scale that up too. So media file segmenter. So you have to have the developer access on Apple for the Mac OS, which is like $99 a year. You can download their free HLS developer tools once you have that. They're free after you pay the subscription. So they're not free, but whatever. You get it along with everything else that you get with a developer thing. But media file segmenter will basically, I'll point out the important parameter there. -T is the time chunk that you're making. So I'm making a 10-second. I encoded everything in those presets 7 and 8 to a 10-second GOP, and I ran through all of those files that had closed or fixed GOPs. They're both closed and fixed. There's actually a difference, but excuse me. So 10 seconds on all of those, and what it will do, here I'll just run it again to show you what it produces. Let me, that's episode pro, preset 8, so I'm going to hit return. So basically it's a short video, so it makes all the chunks, and as it's making each chunk, it shows you the bit rate if it exceeded what it thinks the average bit rate is. So it makes the first segment and it reports 628 kilobits is the new max, and then it ends at the very end with what the average bit rate is and then what the max bit rate is. And this is taking into account also the wrapper that goes around the chunk. So it's not just video information, right? It wraps it in a timestamp thing. So that takes up some size. Not a lot. It shouldn't be more than 2 to 3% greater than what the video chunk would be just with the video and audio bytes. And the good news is that when I ran most of any of the encoders that I used in this test, if you look at presets 7 and 8, I'm going to focus on the main profile ones, not the baseline. They're about the same. You'll see that, let me scroll down here so they're the only ones in view. Oh, come on. There it is. So you'll notice that ffmpeg H.264, I had the bit rate was 904 as it was reported by, oh, I forgot to mention that tool, Media Info Mac, one of my favorite tools, Media Info. You can buy it on the App Store on a Mac. I think they have a Windows version as well, but what I like about this tool is if a client gives me a bunch of compressions that I don't know how they compressed and their compressionist left or fired or whatever, died, I can take that video, hopefully it didn't die, but I say that because I think I might die. The full report here, I can go in and it will tell me a lot of information. What it was encoded with, baseline, what level it's at, frame rate, how many reference frames. Great. I can see if it's going to be compatible, like if they have an older, what was the video bitrate mode as it was encoded. What was, sometimes you'll see information like main concept in here. If you run it through ffmpeg, ffmpeg's pretty nice in the sense that it will automatically show you a lot of the command line options. So you can even put more in there if you know how to manipulate it. But notice that a lot of the settings are spelled out here, these low-level H.264 parameters. I haven't gone into half of these, but it shows me the motion estimation method. It shows me the sub motion estimation level. It just shows me so much information. Mixed refs, it's all there in the file, like just so I don't have to like remember it, right? It's all there. Media info will show that. Anyway, so that's how I took the bit rate out. Media info basically took the real bit rate, which is just basically taking how many bits are in the file, dividing it by the duration. So that's why I say actual bit rate, 904. But when HLS got done with it, it was saying the average bit rate was 925. Its maximum bit rate was 929. That's pretty good for an adaptive stream, right? Because there wasn't much variance from one chunk to the next. there's some schools of thoughts that think it's okay to use dramatic VBR in chunks. But to me, that will break the whole heuristics engine, right? Like if you are, let's say, watching a 3 megabit stream and then all of a sudden the next chunk is really a 5 megabit chunk, well then that's a problem because I'm watching the 3 megabit because I didn't have 5 megabits, right? So that could cause a delay in how that chunk is downloaded. Now, truth be told, I think the reason why some folks think you can use VBR is because you typically buffer a few chunks once you subscribe to a stream, so a certain stream. So if you have an errant block or two that's a little bit bigger than the next, that's not such a big deal. But if it's dramatically bigger, then I'd be concerned about it. You'll notice that on some of these encodes, like Adobe Media Encoder, which I had set to a closed GOP, and let me make sure that's CBR. Yeah, oh no, that's the VBR one. But it's if I use VBR, it exceeded by 32% the average bit rate. That's a pretty high percent to exceed the bit rate by. I think Apple worries if you submit a stream to the App Store, or rather an app to the App Store that uses HLS, if it goes beyond 15%, then that starts to be, I think it's 15%, but you don't want it to go too far beyond what your average bit rate is, what it's advertised in the manifest. Now the good news is it's all up to us how we tell our systems to advertise their bit rates as, right? So as long, then this is my only problem with a lot of clients that I see that come to me with adaptive streaming, is that they'll create a preset. Let's say, I'll make up a number, 800 kilobits is the total bit rate. They run it through their encoder, just assuming it's going to actually make an 800 kilobit stream, and that's what they'll put as the posted system bit rate for that video. They don't run it through any validation. If you do, I mean, you could run that as part of an ingest, right? It can be automated. It's not a big deal. Like I said, I think there's a non-Apple version of that segmenter that can do the exact same thing and give you the same result to tell you what the overhead's going to be. But if it doesn't matter so much that I have the overhead in any of these encoders. What matters is that I then use that max bit rate. So if my maximum bit rate on a 600 kilobit encode is actually 845, well, just put that number as your system bit rate in your manifest, right? So that's the more important thing, is just make sure the bit rates that you're advertising in your manifest are actually reflective of what comes out of your encoding system. And then then you won the bet. You can walk away, use your VBR over CBR, I don't care. But as long as your manifest thinks it's watching something that it's really getting ultimately, that's what I would care about. I'm going to wrap up because it's getting close to booze time. So if it's not already here, observations. Again, this is sort of a quick recap. The baseline encodes were fairly comparable across all the encoders that I tested. ffmpeg did seem to rival all the others when it came to main profile and the extended B frame options you can use in ffmpeg. Again, you could probably tweak all the same ones to the same extent in Squeeze and Episode. HLS manifest, this is what I just mentioned, need to reflect your actual maximum bit rates. Adobe Media Encoder created a reasonable baseline. I'm just, again, throwing a bone there. The biggest thing that I was upset about with Squeeze 9 was that there's no reference frame control in their H.264 implementation. My recommendation is basically that ffmpeg is the most cost-effective encoder, basically because it doesn't cost you any money to use it right away. Again, there could be commercial licensing aspects of it, but any of the other systems, if you use them at scale, and I do list cloud options, right? You can use Squeeze in the cloud. You can use Rosette Carbon Coder in the cloud on your own Windows instances on Amazon. So, and there are cost-effective ways to use those, but there's the ffmpeg is going to be cheapest in terms of the actual encoder that you have to put. The other reason I like ffmpeg too is that anytime a new enhancement is released to H.264 or ffmpeg, all you have to do is download and recompile it. You don't have to wait for another vendor who's implementing it as a third option to release their new version of it, because they're going to have to run it through their own tests. The other recommendation is just making sure, I mean, I used a really nice 1080p Getty image source file. It didn't need any deinterlacing. ffmpeg isn't going to be a great pre-processing tool. It can do a lot of pre-processing, don't get me wrong. It can deinterlace and things like that, but that's where a lot of these other tools that were built around broadcast workflows are going to have better deinterlacers, for example. So I would say if ffmpeg is part of your workflow, do your best to ensure that any of the content going into that workflow is final and not like, you don't, the last thing you want is hard-coded interlacing in your last file, right? I mean, we've all seen interlacing that you can't remove after it's been encoded, right? So that would be a horrible scenario. Oh, discounts. I forgot discounts. I got discounts for you. So that's a crazy coupon code. I didn't realize it was that long, but it's MK. Should I read it out loud? I think it's legible. If you can't read it, I'm not allowed to tweet that. That doesn't mean you can't, but I don't recommend you do it. They said, when I brought this up with Sorensen, they said, I'll come back to that code. So that's off Wirecast too. So I didn't talk about Wirecast. I didn't really get into the live encoding part of it as much as I wanted to. Review the sheet that I put up on Google Docs to talk about it. What's good, I want to just quickly make a shout out. Teradek's the platinum sponsor. They've been gracious. They sent me a video. It's amazing what this $700 device can create. It still doesn't necessarily have all the options that a Cube does, but these, you have to pay up to 10 times the amount of what these things cost to get even just a few more options in your H.264 compression for live. So I'm not saying they're not worth that money, those more expensive options from VBRIC or Vuecast. There's a wide swath of tools out there. This is obviously going to fit a specific type of solution. Vuecast has great portable units that you can bring around with you. VBRIC does as well. They just deal with different markets and are going after different types of customers with those products. Let me get you. So Squeeze is an easy discount, and this is the crazy thing. He told me, Dan, the product manager. So you guys in this room get 25% off Squeeze 9 if you call this week. It's limited to this week. You have to mention that you were in my breakout group at Streaming Media East, and you'll get 25% off the cost of Squeeze 9. That's pro or regular. He said I was allowed to tweet, though, a 15% discount. So only Twitter gets 50%, which doesn't make any sense because anyone could just say, oh, I was in Robert's session and I'm at Stream Media East, right? I mean, I don't know how they gonna, I don't know who's in the room. Like, they're gonna be like, Rob, was Cassandra in your room? I'm like, yeah, totally. Anyway, thank you. That's it. I don't know if we're over, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to stick around.
What URL?
Oh, that's a good point. So you can go there now. I would recommend not downloading it. I can't stop you, but if you go to videorx.com/sm for streaming media, then you can actually see. I actually have a bunch of player examples that I used in my workshops that are up online. I'm going to make a zip file. It's not up there yet. You can see there's a next-gen player zip from Stream Media West. I have not updated it, but just remember videorx.com/sm, and you can even just look at the date to see which one's the most recent. You can see some of the clips I've uploaded, but I didn't upload a final batch. So I actually used this my server as my repo to move files around from encoding on Rosette last night in my office and moving them here. So there's a bunch of temporary files. So don't they're like red herrings if you download these files because they're not the things I want you to look at. Some of them. So if you, I mean, there's nothing bad. I mean, there's nothing that's gonna not make me run for political office in there. But I'm just saying it's not the most of it's not final. But remember the URL. If you don't, you can always tweet me, email me, phone me, whatever it takes, and you can get the docs. Yes? Have you evaluated the Intel Media? I have not. I'm looking at QuickSync for live encoding, like with Wowza and doing transcoding via QuickSync, but I have not been able to do any tests with it yet. I'm excited though. I'm excited. Okay, right here.
Have you evaluated the differences between Telestream episode and the more enterprise-focused products like Vantage or Agility?
I have not. I have a client that uses Episode and Episode Engine, in that, but I have not looked at any of their bigger offerings on that level. I have a feeling that a lot of the lower level encoding bits are going to be the same, but it's more going to be about source format and ingest on those products. Yeah. Any other quick questions? I'll also be drinking, so you can grab me there.
Just one more.
Oh, that was on VideoRx too. That was just a free tool that I built. So, oh, Media Info Mac was the only other one that I showed here. I'm a big fan of Media Info, and they just released a bug fix like a month ago that really sped it up. Like there was, like if you drag the file into it, like the Finder would sit there for like 30 seconds trying to do something with it. So they fixed that bug. That was a really bad bug. But Media Info Mac, it's a pretty cheap app, I think, on the App Store, and that's a desktop app. It's not an iOS. Oh, Media Info Mac is the name of it. So if I was going to search for it real quick. It said Media Inspector there, but its name is, so if I go up here, Media Info, one word, and you search for it, it's going to be, you don't want this, you want the one that you pay 99 cents for. Oh, is it? Jeez Louise, let me see here. Oh, it is, oh, they did change the name. Thank you, Media Inspector. Why am I still, even though the rollover still says Media Info Mac, great. How does that happen? Thank you, Jeff. So you leave it to my client to tell me where it is. There it is, Media Inspector. I have it installed. It's telling me, oh, it doesn't tell me, it's $2.99. So Media Inspector. Thank you. They did change the name from Media Info Mac. So Media Inspector, and you can also export those results. I haven't figured out a way to automate it yet, but I mean, honestly, if you need something that's going to also give you a lot of information too, ffprobe comes with ffmpeg, and ffprobe gives you a tremendous amount of information too. And you could probably use ffprobe on a command line to do the same thing. Yes?
Also, one other thing, I know you mentioned Rosette.
Yes?
It's now ProMedia.
Oh, it's true that Harmonic changed the name. It's ProMedia Carbon. And I always want to call it ProMedia Coder, but ProMedia Carbon is the name now for Rosette Carbon Coder. So ProMedia, and WFS is still the name for the workflow system that it works with. That's a tremendously powerful API, the whole workflow system that they've developed with WFS, and ProMedia Carbon is just one aspect of that workflow. So, all right, I think we're ready to go to the networking reception. Let's do it. Thank you.